Good morning. Good morning. It's good to see all of you here today. I want to call the study committee to order here for us to begin this really important conversation. I want to thank each of you for pausing and making this time available to us. I know we are joined by at least one member online and one set of speakers. So we will continue to work in the cautious world that we are all in too, but to try to make sure that we receive all information. You know, this has been discussed for a long time. I want y'all to know this brain from DPH has been sitting on my desk for a little while, little wonderful squishy ball there for that. Some time ago, I was invited to a national conference of state legislators, small meeting about some of the development issues for children. It was an honor to be there, but it began a discussion as well about the different issues that impact our little people's brains. And this one, I think, is particularly important. It has been the brainchild of one of my true heroes, which is Dr. Toomey. We cannot thank her enough for everything she's doing right now for our state and our Georgians, without a doubt. Her perseverance and her grace is greatly appreciated more than ever. We realizing, though, that we needed to really take a look at this, and particularly because in 2012, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention updated their recommendations on children's blood levels and interventions, and Georgia's are different from those. And so the difference in the CDC's recommendations and our Georgia laws has brought us to this day where we need to make sure that we are not missing a population of children that are exposed to the adverse reactions of any effects of lead in their bloodstream. So we need to talk about it. We need to dive deep into it and see what we can come together as a committee and as a state to do to make sure that these really dreadful, irreversible conditions are not even impacting children, if at all possible. So that will be where we are trying to go. I want y'all to know we do at this point plan to have at least 4 meetings, maybe a 5th, to this month. The second one right now, you could put on your calendar and hopefully we'll make that happen. Actually, it will be Monday, September 13th. So we'll plan on moving forward with that one if we can affirm all of the speakers and presentations we'd like to have here. And then the goal will be to have 2 in October. And possibly if we need to come back together to talk again and finalize our recommendations, try to do that whenever we come together to deal with redistricting during that special session that we have ahead. So that's the goal. We'll see, like everything in today's world, if we can stick to that and try to do it. So we have a great committee here. I'm thrilled to be working with everyone that's here. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask those that are here, and then if we can connect on Zoom, I know Representative Drenner is there right now. We'll try to do that as well and give them a minute or two. So I'm going to start with you, Ms. Representative Maynor, and see if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, what brings you to this place, your district, where you are.
Okay, thank you, Chairwoman Dempsey. My name is Representative Misha Maynor. I represent District 56, which is in the heart of Atlanta. Past experience, I was a speechwriter for the Assistant Surgeon General at CDC, and I'm a physical therapist by trade and very excited to delve into this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. I know you're going to make a great contribution to us. And Dr. Chris Rustin here is representing, he's the Deputy Commissioner for DPH and is representing their voice and presence here on the committee.
So thank you, Chairwoman Dempsey. Just a little bit about myself. I've been working professionally in public health for over 21 years and currently serving as the Deputy Commissioner to Dr. Toomey. But lead poisoning prevention is something that's near and dear to my heart. I spent 7 years working on a graduate degree on this very subject. So it's something that I take very seriously, and I'm very pleased to be on this committee to help. And thank you. I look forward to contributing.
Thank you. So before I move on to some of our staff members as well, who are vital to this conversation, let's see if we can connect with Representative Drenner and if she can introduce herself.
Hello, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's nice to see all of you today. My name is Carla Drenner and I represent House District 85. I have been in the legislature for a number of years, and previous efforts on this particular issue I've been involved in, and look forward to participating in the committee and helping to continue the conversation on this very important issue.
Thank you so much. It's good to have you with us. And then also here to my left is Tara Boccolt, so important as a policy and budget analyst. But I want you to tell us a little bit about yourself as well. We're going to give you the microphone.
Good morning. I'm Tara Boccolt. I work for the House Budget and Research Office. I've been there about a little over 7 years, and I staff the Health Appropriations Committee, as well as Human Relations and Aging and Budget and Fiscal Affairs Oversight, and a special committee on quality healthcare.
Excellent. She will be the glue that pulls us all together as well. So very important. Betsy, I don't think y'all have microphones, but if you would both introduce yourself, we'll turn it up. Maybe the closest one may pick it up. Do we have it on? What is it?
I am Betsy Howerton. I am Betsy, what number are you? 15. Hi, I'm Betsy Howerton. I work for Legislative Council. I've been there about 19 years, and I do the Health Committee on both the House and the Senate side. And happy to be here. You want me to introduce? Okay. And we have a new attorney that started in our office yesterday. To my left, Sarah Crittenden. She's going to be doing insurance, and we're thrilled to have her. She actually came from the Department of Insurance, so has a really strong background in that area.
That is great. I'm going to introduce myself, and I see we have another member stepping in. So I'll give him a second to take a seat, and then Ken tell us a little bit about Matthew, where you're from and those kind of things. You catch your breath just a minute from running in. I'll do it mine, and then I'll do.
Hey, Matthew Gamble from Cartersville, House District 15, and appreciate the opportunity to serve on this study committee.
Right. And that's in Bartow
That's right.
County, my
Bartow
neighbor
County, yep.
over there as well. So Katie Dempsey, I chair human resources, and I cannot tell you how grateful I am for the opportunity to step into this field and see what we can do to help children. So that will bring us to our first presenter today. And it will be on Zoom. The others are going to be in person, but this, I understand, will be our very first. And it is Director, and I'm going to do my best to say this right, but I want you to feel like you can correct me. Director Christy Kurniak, maybe, and Dr. Sun from Georgia Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. Going to see if we can connect y'all here in just a second.
Hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. You'll be up in just a second too on our screens as well. And you can take this moment to tell me how to really say your name.
Kuryatnik.
Kuryatnik.
Kuryatnik. Yes, it's a difficult one.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the help.
Sure.
Okay, we're ready. We can see you and hear you.
Okay. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. I'm hoping everyone can see this screen and we're good to go.
We are. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, well, good morning. I am Christy Kuryatnik, and the program director of the Georgia Healthy Homes and Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. And this morning, I'm just going to give a brief overview of our program and touch a little bit about some of the issues of lead poisoning. So the primary function of our program is the management of childhood lead poisoning. And we do this through several strategies. We promote screening and conduct state surveillance. We provide clinical case management for EBL children. And an EBL child, basically EBL stands for elevated blood lead level.
so it's another way for saying lead poisoned child. We target education and outreach to healthcare providers, high-risk populations, and the general public. We conduct primary prevention interventions, as indicated by the data, and support housing compliance and enforcement. And just a little bit about our program background. Excuse me. In 1993, we were formed as a program in the epidemiology section. 2008, moved to environmental health. And in 2000, we were first funded by the CDC. And we currently have CDC funding with some state supplemental funding as well. We are, of course, in the Department of Public Health, in the Health Protection Division, and in the Environmental Health section. Our staff includes myself as director, our epidemiologist, Dr. Yu Sun, our field consultant, LaShonda Lee, clinical case manager, Trina Suttles, and program administrator, Marcia McLeod. So let's start by talking about how environmental controls work. So in 1978, lead was removed from residential paint. And this was through an action from the Consumer Product Safety Committee. And in 1986, primary phase out of the lead in gasoline was complete. It was an action that the EPA started in 1975. And in 1994, there was a study that showed that the US blood lead levels declined by 78% from 1978 to 1991. These two actions alone brought about a drastic decline of blood lead levels nationwide. And though we've made great strides to lower lead exposures overall, we still are concerned about legacy lead in old paint, soil, and other products. We are also concerned about lower levels of lead, as more recent research has found a slew of adverse effects from just a minuscule amount of lead in the body. Think of it in terms of covering your fingernail with lead dust. This is enough dust to kill a child. And I'm not going to go into all the health effects right now. I know we've got some great speakers coming up that can cover that. So lead in paint is the most common lead exposure in Georgia, and it can be found in pre-1978 homes. Children can be exposed to lead-based paint, particularly at window seals or window troughs. Also, dust is created by impact surfaces, such as the grinding of windows or doors, and it creates dust that falls to the floor. And peeling paint from the exterior of the home, particularly on the porch where children play, or in the soil where old paint has been settled, can also be major exposure sources. This is an infographic of the likelihood that homes based on age would contain lead-based paint. As you can see, the older the home, the more likely it is to have some lead-based paint. Homes built before 1940 have an 87% chance of having lead-based paint in them. And lead has properties that make it appealing to many, many products. It adds strength, resilience, it brightens colors, and it is mold resistant. And this is why it was added to paint so long ago, to control moisture from damaging the home in a pre-air conditioned era. It's also found in some imported cosmetics, jewelry, and folk remedies, and we can discuss more on that later on. All lead tests are reportable to the Department of Public Health within 7 days, no matter what the result is. We collect these reports from labs and doctor offices. They're submitted through our public health surveillance system, SENS. And Dr. Sun, our epidemiologist, then analyzes this data for various reports. Dr. Sun is present virtually, and she has provided some data analysis for the committee to review. So the only way a child can be diagnosed with lead poisoning is through blood lead testing. You can't look at a child and determine that that child has lead poisoning. We need a blood test to determine that. And DPH recommends testing at ages 1 and 2, and if a child is on Medicaid, that is a requirement. And also before age 5 if not previously tested. Confirmed elevated blood lead level, or EBLL, means 1 venous blood draw or 2 capillary blood draws within 3 months apart, which are lab analyzed. The Georgia Code defines confirmed lead poisoning as 20 micrograms of lead per deciliter for a single test, or between 15 and 19 micrograms of lead per deciliter in 2 tests taken at least 3 months apart. And DPH provides services for EBL children at 5 and 10 micrograms per deciliter. Certain levels trigger actions. And in 2012, the CDC established a reference level of 5 micrograms per deciliter. This level was based on the US population of children ages 1 through 5 years, who are in the top 2.5% of children tested for lead. And when our program receives a test result at this level, we send exposure and nutrition information out to the parents. At 10 micrograms per deciliter is the environmental intervention level, or home assessment, conducted by one of Department of Public Health's certified lead inspector risk assessors. This level must be confirmed before they get the home inspection. So the home assessment is conducted at the level of 10 micrograms per deciliter. However, the Georgia Childhood Lead Exposure Control has not kept pace with current science and the research of lead exposure and health effects. Recommend that the public health action be taken for exposures to lead at 5 micrograms per deciliter or more. CDC recommends an in-home environmental investigation at 5 micrograms per deciliter. However, the current law requires a child's lead exposure to reach 15 to 19 micrograms per deciliter before DPH can take regulatory action to ensure lead hazards are mitigated in a rental home. In other words, Georgia's children must show blood lead levels 3 to 4 times higher than the current CDC recommended public health action. So I'm just going to touch on some of the risk factors that could expose children to lead, especially lead-based paint. The child's age, because babies and toddlers play on the floor and have a lot of hand-to-mouth action, it's easy for them to be exposed to paint dust. Also chips, because they love to peel paint from walls and place it in their mouths. Age of housing, like I said previously, pre-1978 homes have lead-based paint and other structural issues. Poverty, it indicates the type of home that can be afforded, and usually it's a substandard home. Good nutrition can actually fight lead poisoning, but undernourished children have a more difficult time. Medicaid is an indicator for poverty. Regional variations on housing can be a factor in both urban and rural areas. And race and ethnicity is also a factor, as data indicates. So just a few studies to mention on the future outcomes of lead-poisoned children. Last year, Case Western Reserve University released a study following 10,000 children who experienced elevated blood lead levels before the age 3 through age 23, using public data to create a record of their life. Their findings were that adults who had experienced childhood lead poisoning were more likely to be incarcerated, experience homelessness, and rely on public assistance than children without. In a 2003, Canfield calculated for every 1 microgram per deciliter increase in blood lead levels, there's a 0.47 IQ points lost. And for every IQ point that's lost, there is a 2.39% decrease in lifetime earnings. And cost to society due to lead-based paint or lead poisoning. According to the CDC, the cost for childhood lead poisoning to the United States is $50 billion, and much of these costs are paid for by Medicaid. According to CDC, a lead-poisoned child may cost over $5,600 in medical treatment and special education costs. And for every dollar invested in reducing lead hazards in the home, there's a $17 to $221 return on investment. Our program has 7 regional-led coordinators who are state and federally funded. We also have an additional 43 certified lead inspector risk assessors that work at local health departments throughout the state. They conduct home inspections for children at 10 micrograms per deciliter. And it also includes other places where the child may spend time, like grandma's house or daycare or other family members' homes as well. It's not just limited to that child's actual residence. At the bottom left, there's a picture there of one of the risk assessors taking a paint chip sample from the exterior of a home. Over on the right is one of our risk assessors taking a reading in the paint, the exterior paint, with an XRF device. And that's it for my presentation, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. Are we also hearing from Dr. Sun?
She has included, sorry, let's see, I gotta go back to sharing screen here. She has included some handouts on some data that you can review, and she's available if you have questions.
Okay, so committee members, those are in your folder there. We may want to take a look at them, and then if there are questions later, perhaps, if that's okay, we can get back with you. We can get Tara also to reach out. Thank you for your presentation. Does anyone have any questions from the committee or any comments you'd like to make? If you will just punch your button. Okay, Representative Maynard.
Thank you for the presentation. My question is about the return on investment. The maximum I saw, I think, was about $221 in that far range, the highest range. How does that calculate to the cost? Is it the number of kids that are exposed nationwide, why the cost is so much? It just seems like the return on investment with prevention would be more.
So that is a CDC fact, and I can definitely get more information on that and report back to that. But basically what it's talking about is with lead hazard control, every dollar spent on mitigating some of the issues in the home, then have a return on the health of the child or the exposure. But yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, we'll see if we can get a little more on that if possible with that.
Sure.
Inquire into that. Okay, are there any other questions? Anyone that's joining us on Zoom, I will introduce another member that has, no, he's not, excuse us. We have another member that's trying to join us, so we'll get to that. Representative Mark Newton, another member of the committee. Any other questions from anyone? Not seeing any. Thank you so very much. This is a great deal of information, and we'll dig into this and see if there are more to get back to you or to Dr. Sun on as well. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And so our next presenter is Dr. Robert Geller as well. And Dr. Geller, I believe you're with us, and I'll get you to start off by introducing yourself a little bit, telling us you have a strong background. I'd like for you to share that with the committee and all who are watching us as well today. There is a handout too that the committee members should have as well to go along with this. 1 minute, we're gonna let us okay.
Take this off for the purpose of speaking.
Great.
So I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to present to this committee, and I want to introduce myself a little bit. So my background is in pediatrics and medical toxicology. I've been with Emory University for 33 years and been the medical director of the Poison Center. I am also on the medical staff of both Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Grady Health System. And the resources for treating children who have significant lead poisoning enough to need medical therapy are uniquely sourced at Children's of Hugh Spalding, which is located several blocks from here. And that is historically the only place in the state stocking the antidote for immediate access. Okay. The down button, well, down button is not working. Let's try this. Okay, I can make that work. Okay, so let's do that. That would make things easier. Yes. Okay, let's try this. So disclaimer first, my opinions are not endorsed specifically by anybody. But as I said, I am been asked to speak, invited to speak by several organizations, Children's and the American Academy of Pediatrics, Georgia chapter. And so I'm going to present my expert opinion. And so the outline of what I'm hoping to speak about is lead effects, lead sources in the built environment and outdoors, measuring lead, some possible steps to reduce lead effects, some talk about risk communication and making sure that we stick to our facts and don't go beyond our facts, and then leave time for questions. So the fundamental principles of pediatric environmental health speak to the fact that children are not just little adults. And Dr. Kuryatnik already touched on this, and I'm going to overlap a lot with what she said, which is intentional. So children's maturity changes with age, just as behavior and other features of childhood. And children are different because, as noted, little kids crawl, and you take in air through your mouth and your nose. You don't take in, we're not fish, we don't take in air through gills or anything like that. And so when you're lower to the ground and you're crawling, or you walk, even when you're toddling, you're close to the ground. And as we all know, heavier than air compounds settle. And so kids are breathing air that has more heavier than air compounds in the air. Kids also don't read. And so the attractive hazard is a container that has colored liquid in it that looks attractive. Could be apple juice, or it could be Pine Sol. It could be simple green, or it could be some green soda. You can't tell unless you can read the label. Children also don't eat the same things as adults. And their higher metabolic rate says that they need more food intake per kilogram of body weight. And therefore, if that food is contaminated with residues of pesticides or something else, they are at more risk. Particularly further, young children don't eat the same thing. How many people had applesauce for breakfast? How many people had rice cereal for breakfast? And so the kids are getting different things. Speaking specifically about lead, we know that lead causes significant brain damage at very high levels. And that still is a feature occasionally, but that is a very rare event. What is much more common is the intellectual impact on children at low levels. CDC and EPA and the science we have found no clearly defined safe level. This is not a number that you can say if you're below X, it's great. As already noted, the U.S. Advisory Committee on Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention recommends intervention at a blood lead level greater than 5 microgram per deciliter. It's important to understand that lead effects, when we talk about a number, are observed on an average population basis. So saying 5 doesn't mean that every child is hurt at 5, and doesn't mean that children are not hurt. There aren't children who are hurt at a 4.9. So it's not applying to every child. And so we know that as the number goes up, we have more and more issues. It's not a linear curve, but it is important to note that lead in childhood has been shown to cause disease in adults later. And the risk of things like high blood pressure and other issues, kidney failure, chronic kidney disease in adults is also related to, in part, to lead exposures as a child. So the recommended testing, as noted earlier, is testing or questionnaire-based surveillance, depending on how high risk the child is perceived to be. And also, adults working with lead have required testing rules as well. In Georgia, we are good that all blood lead retests, all blood lead level results are required reports to the state of Georgia, so we actually know what's going on in the state. And so if you compare what we expected to have reported based on our Medicaid rolls, because we all know all the kids who are Medicaid, and we compare those that we get, we miss a lot of samples. Why do we miss a lot of samples? The question is that a failure to report those results to the state, even though it's a required report, or is it those kids are not getting sampled? And is that undersampling due to skipped healthcare visits that the kids who are on Medicaid don't get all their well child checks? Or is it failure to sample of visits that occur? The likelihood is that all of these are playing into our problem. But there was a 2017 publication that stated that Georgia performed poorly in terms of having expected numbers, and that the data was only available in 10% of the cases expected versus a national average that was somewhere in the 40s. After that, there was a lot of investigation done, which is not published. And what we know is that there is a partial problem with reporting. Not all reportable diseases are actually reported. We know that's true, generally speaking. But we also know that parents who come in for well child checks in much of the state do not get blood drawn at the sample and are referred instead to an adjacent lab to which they fail to go. So they've gotten their well child check, but they never got their lead level. They come back to the next visit, the doctor says, I didn't get a result on your lead level, you need to go get it, to which the parent still doesn't do it. We have other issues that we know that after the age of 18 months, compliance with scheduled health checks goes down. And so that children who, because you're not getting vaccines after the age of 18 months until age 4, that parents tend to consider those checks less important, which is not consistent with good healthcare. When we talk about blood lead levels in the past, it's important to recognize where we're coming from. And this publication shows blood lead levels of children in the United States in 1976 to 1980, stratified by age and race. This is US data, not Georgia data. And what you see here, if I can get my cursor to do something for us, is that the average was that only 22% of all children of all races had a blood lead less than 10. Again, we are now looking at 5s. And if you're looking at 63% of the children had a blood lead between 10 and 19. Lead at that time was primarily from lead and gas. And Dr. Kuryadnik showed you a slide, which I'm going to show you again, showing how much de-leading gasoline made a difference. And it's noteworthy to note that lead in fuel in the United States is only present in aviation fuel. It is not present in other fuel sources. And that the last country in the world to use lead in automotive gas just de-leaded its gas last month in Algeria. We have had lead paint limited in use since 1973. It is currently used only for certain industrial sources. Lead is also present in crafts such as fishing sinkers and cast figurines, automotive uses, and it has been used in plumbing because of its good features there. And we have progressively limited lead in plumbing to the point that the brass alloy used in plumbing fixtures now has to be lead-free since 2001. So where do we get our lead now? Why is this still a problem? We have peeling paint, particularly in buildings built before 1973. We have a large stock of those buildings. They include schools, daycare centers, homes, and public buildings. Lead is going to affect primarily those that are less well-maintained and have peeling paint, but it does not limit itself to peeling paint because all paint has a characteristic called chalking. Chalking means that the surface of the paint gradually peels off over time at the molecular level. And that's considered a desirable feature because it makes the paint retain its color and look like it was put there originally. So all paint chalks. If the surface layer of paint contains lead, you are putting lead dust into the house. If the lead is buried under paneling, it's buried under 3 layers of paint, whatever, the chalking paint is not going to displace lead. Water comes through service lines. That service lines, by my definition, are going to be pipes that bring the water from the pumping station, from the reservoir to the pumping station, from the pumping station to the house or to the building. We're not talking about lines inside the house. We're talking about lines that supply the building. In many communities, those service lines are old. And the cost of replacing those is huge because you not only have to replace it, you have to dig it up first. You have to find it, you have to dig it up, you have to, and then you're going to have to pave the street again after you tear it up the street. So old service lines are a problem, and in many communities, this is substantial. And you can go back and look at the nature of this, but in cities such as Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and in smaller cities such as Greensboro, North Carolina, and others, there are issues with service lines that contain lead. I have no data about the extent to which the Atlanta area or Georgia area service lines contain lead, but it's likely that we have them somewhere. In plumbing fixtures, the old plumbing fixtures have more lead, and we've particularly found an issue with water coolers. The wall-mounted or freestanding water coolers often have used lead plumbing to contain the water and circulate it through the cooling system. And so there was a particular effort several years ago to try and replace cooling water coolers that were old. We also know that lead has been an inexpensive toys and jewelry imported because less than 5% of things imported to the US actually get inspected at importation. We also have found in the past that certain spices and foods imported from some sources contain lead, and particularly spices that have a red color have been more impacted. This is the slide I wanted to show you about lead, and the blue line here shows the average blood level in the population between 1976 and 1980, where it dropped from 16 to 9 in 4 years. And it immediately parallels the amount of lead used in gasoline in the United States. So in 1980, the population average blood lead was 9. So measuring the body burden of lead requires a blood draw. And it doesn't need a lot of blood. You need about 1/10 of an ml of blood, but it has to come from getting it somehow, which requires either a venipuncture or a finger stick. Finger sticks are less technically complicated, but still painful. The problem with finger sticks is that they have a higher contamination rate, and so they're more likely to give false values. So if you get an elevated value on a finger stick, you need a second lab sample. The venous sample requires more technical intervention to be able to get it, but on the other hand, it's less likely to be contaminated. The problem we've had lately has been one of analytics. When we're looking at these very low lead levels, the test systems that were located in doctors' offices that could be done on a desktop have been shown to be inaccurate and to miss samples. And so the recommendation over the last few years has been to move away from the lead care systems to a different system, different analytical method called atomic absorption spectrophotometry, which is the gold standard lab. It's a big machine. It's expensive. It's not going to be in doctor's offices. So the lab sample has to be sent to a lab which can run it, whether it's a hospital-based lab or a reference lab, and the result will not be immediately available. That further confounds the ability to work with lead levels because you don't have an answer back while the patient's still in the office. We saw a picture of using the XRF device. And so XRF is currently FDA not approved for measuring lead in people, but it is the gold standard for environmental measurement. This is what the device looks like, or at least one of them. I don't know if this is the one the state's using. And, but this is what is used in home assessments or in building assessments. So Dr. Kuryadnik spoke about lead and IQ, and I want to spend a little bit more time on that. So again, there is no clearly established single threshold at which lead does not have an impact. The data suggests that there's about 1/4 of an IQ point lost per microgram per deciliter for the first 5 microgram per deciliter. About another 4 IQ points lost going from 5 to 20, and about another 4 IQ points lost if you go higher. The normal blood lead has been calculated to be essentially 0, and that number was chosen by doing people who exhumed specimens, skeletons, and measured bone lead from the 1700s. So essentially all blood lead is iatrogenic or societally induced. This is the important piece I want. One of the most important things I want you to look at. This is from the Canfield study, which is the most elaborate study of the lead impact on IQ. And what you see is that at the same blood lead level, which is on the bottom axis, the x-axis, the IQ goes all across the map. So at a blood lead of 5 or thereabouts in the left, you see that the IQ ranges from 130 to 70. And even at an IQ of a blood lead of 20, the IQ ranges from 100 to 20, to 100 to 70, I'm sorry. So blood lead is not the sole predictor of IQ. Blood lead is a factor. Blood lead is an important factor that we want to mitigate any impact on IQ, but it is not the sole source of IQ. Another way of looking at this is looking at, this is the original data on lead in which Dr. Needleman, who's a dentist, was a dentist at Harvard, collected teeth instead of the tooth fairy, paid his kids to bring him the teeth instead of to the tooth fairy in kindergarten, and measured their IQ, and then measured the lead in the teeth. And what you're seeing is that kids with higher IQs had, kids with higher leads had lower IQs. And if you want to look at the difference in the score was about 5 IQ points. There are multiple other studies showing the same association. So what does shifting the population curve do? So this is an exercise in statistics. IQ is defined statistically as an average population mean of 100 with a standard deviation of 10. If you shift the entire population curve, it means you have a 57% increase in the number of kids with an IQ over 70, under 70, and a 50% decrease in kids with a population, in the population with an IQ over 130. So we are losing our most gifted kids, and we're getting more kids who are impaired. So the most important things that we think occur with lead in low levels that we're talking about, in lead levels of 5 and 10, is an impact on ADHD and an impact on disruptive behavior. ADHD, I'm thinking of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So if you look at the data, and I'm going to show you some of the original data, this data shows here that this score, the behavior rating score, is a score that's used to assess the presence of attention deficit. And you see that exposed kids who had a blood lead of 10 or higher are more likely to have a high score and are more likely to have the scores that suggest hyperactivity. And again, here's your p-value, your statistics value showing that this is statistically significant Here's a different study showing data that the children are classified as high lead are more likely to have aggressive behavior, attention deficit, and be delinquent. This is another study showing that children who had high blood leads as children are more likely to have records of arrest for violent crime as young adults. But it's important to note that although this is a statistically true statement, the attributable risk, i.e. the percent of variation attributed to this factor, is between 5 and 9%. So lead did not cause them alone to be arrested, to become violent and be arrested, but it was a risk factor that accounted for this behavior. Other risk factors in lead involve how your body handles lead. Other factors that impact your IQ, obviously parental IQ. The strongest predictor of IQ in a child remains maternal IQ. And there are social factors in terms of social disadvantage, where you grow up, the school education you had available, et cetera. So children at high risk, particularly in homes built using leaded paint, children whose parents work in lead industries, children of parents with lead poisoning, because lead is transmitted transplacentally, children whose siblings have high lead, because that's a marker for the whole setting of being at risk, and children adopted from countries with lower environmental standards, because although we in the United States are adhering to all these standards, many countries are not able to do so. So what can we do? Well, first of all, preventing exposure is the name of the game. We can reduce avoidable releases into the environment. We can do early detection and try and prevent things from getting worse. So the big item, the big ticket, the thing that's most important is terminating exposure to lead and try and eliminate the possibility of a child who has an exposure that's at a low level, but mildly elevated, from becoming more elevated. So that speaks to eliminating lead paint, eliminating lead plumbing, and safe renovation of particularly older homes. Avoiding imported leaded pottery that for cooking or eating, and avoiding ethnic remedies that might contain lead. Prevention is clearly cost effective. Dr. Kuryatnik spoke to the fact that home renovation has a payback that is substantial based on the cost of payback, the cost of renovation versus the cost of lost IQ points and lost productivity is throughout your career. It speaks also to the fact that renovated properties are going to have more value as a renovated property, and therefore could generate substantial additional taxes in having a higher tax assessment. We know that there have been contaminated sites in various places. To my knowledge, there are no heavily lead contaminated sites in Georgia that require specific abatement. So intervention at the individual level involves supportive care. Early intervention programs have been shown to mitigate lead-driven disabilities in terms of behavior, but those cost money. And we wind up doing babies can't wait programs. We wind up doing pre-K, et cetera. And those wind up happening at state expense largely. Chelation is a last resort. It's expensive and it does not change the IQ or behavioral impact of high lead, although it does mitigate further damage. Right now, a single course of therapy would be thousands of dollars for the drug and the management of the lab testing associated with that management. If you do nothing but eliminate exposure, lead levels routinely fall on their own. This is a function of your body's remodeling of bones, of maintaining your bone structure, and of your kidneys eliminating this. However, it takes months, as you can see here, a high lead level to decline back below 5 takes anywhere, depending on how high it was, can take as much as 6 years. Interventions that could be useful. First, the question is assessing the built environment. If you know that a child has an elevated blood lead, we should be assessing the environment that they're in, even if their blood lead level is only over 5 as compared to where we are. Because lead is transmitted transplacentally, we would like to eliminate it from getting into a fetus and a newborn before we have a chance. So we would like to extend our blood lead monitoring, not just to pregnant women, but to women of childbearing age before they become pregnant, because you cannot treat lead poisoning with a chelator during pregnancy because that's a teratogenic drug. We could decide to subsidize remediation of structures found to be the source of childhood lead poisoning. And in some jurisdictions, this has been done to great success. I believe it was Massachusetts and Rhode Island that were doing this at one time. And what that says is that, for example, that if a owner spent X dollars on renovating the house to eliminate the lead hazard that had occurred to a child, that we would give them back a tax abatement of part of that cost on their tax return. That would cost us something, but it would improve the value of the property for future, and it would reduce the lost productivity in IQ, ultimately results in income tax. And we could facilitate more complete blood lead monitoring of children under 3 years of age by somehow improving the likelihood that these tests are actually completed. It's not something that pediatricians have not tried to do. It's something that requires a better way of being able to get these samples completed and that chain completed. I want to speak a little bit about risk communication first, because we've had a fiasco with the situation that happened in Flint, Michigan, and that's what people come to mind, and I want to make very clear on what we have. So first of all, the fundamental story about risk communication is you must provide accurate and complete information, accurate, clear, and complete information to the public. It's very easy to lose credibility, very hard to get it back once you lose it. Exaggerating your data leads to bad policy and public distrust. So it's essential to have careful and skilled communications before you go public. So what happened in Flint, Michigan? Just to recap briefly. The state and city switched the water supply from Detroit municipal system to taking water straight out of the Flint River in April 2014. They also stopped adding an additive called orthophosphates to the water supply to save money. Orthophosphates reduce the likelihood of stuff built up on the edge of the supply pipes leaching off the pipe and getting in the water. There were multiple community concerns about water quality, et cetera. It was shown, this study was published, and I just want to point out, they reviewed blood lead levels for children greater than 5 years before and after the water change, and assessed the percent of elevated blood lead levels in both time periods. And they found that the incidence of elevated blood lead, defined in the article as a blood lead greater than 5, increased from 2.4% of the population to 4.9%. No significant change was seen outside the city. Okay, so what we have is that the incidence of lead went up. That's a bad thing, clearly a bad thing. But does that merit this statement? Poisoned drinking water causing irreparable brain damage. Or this one, who is criminally responsible for the lead poisoned, permanently brain damaged children of Flint? Or this one, how the Flint water crisis could send an entire generation to prison. Or this one, Flint mayor declares man-made disaster over lead-tainted water supply. So we know that the situation in Flint with the water change was a bad move. Not questioning that. That was a bad decision. But what about the 95% of kids who were not affected by that elevated blood lead? Are we going to label them as permanently brain damaged? And the other problem we had was that once that happened, property values in Flint plummeted. All property values plummeted. Employers left Flint, and Flint wound up economically challenged for several years. It's starting to come back, but that's 7 years ago. That's not the message we want. Furthermore, if you look at this data, this is a different In 2005, Michigan completed the years-long process of collecting 500,000 lead blood tests. Back then, 26% of kids tested had high blood levels. And in the hardest hit levels of Flint, only 10.6% of kids had levels that were elevated at that level. So again, taking the whole picture, we need all our data. We need to make the right decisions. But we don't want to create a sense of panic that people in Georgia are not being taken care of, or that their health care is not acting appropriately. So I mentioned issues about water supplies and lead service lines. And it is possible, if you have lead service lines that are problematic, to install water filters that will at point of use so that you don't drink or cook with leaded water. That is a personal expense, but it is an alternative to replacing everything that needs to be done. So having said that, I'd like to entertain any questions.
Representative Gamble.
Well, Dr. Geller, thank you for your presentation. Very helpful for me to understand some of the things that you went over. I think that one of the things that jumped out about the Flint, Michigan situation is that the media exaggerated a little bit in the way it was presented. But my question is, I guess, related to the lead in pipes and the exposure there. Is there a way that water can be filtered, or is it impossible to remove the contamination from water if it travels through a lead pipe?
So typically there are filters that can be placed either for the whole house or in the faucets that are used to supply drinking water that are able to filter lead to a negligible level after that point. They require replacement periodically, but it is possible to do that. And you can get them from multiple sources. If you were to go look at a certain online purveyor that all of us use, you'll find multiple choices. If you're going to use a filter like that, there is a standard called the National Sanitation Foundation, or NSF standard. I think it's standard 53. It says that the filter, it meets that standard, will filter lead to a negligible level.
But safe to say that those filters are probably very expensive.
They're going to be somewhere in the ballpark of $50 to $100, and it'll last, depending on how much water you use, 1 to 2 years.
Okay. And even if you replace your lead pipes in your house, if the service line is still lead, it's still impacting your water.
Correct.
Yeah.
But also remember that when water flows through pipes over a period of time, there are minerals in the water that settle out on the edge of the pipe. And so that as you go over a period of time, the passageway in the pipe, I'll call it the lumen, which may be a technical term, but the passageway that in the pipe gets narrower as the minerals deposit. But the water being supplied only comes in contact with those minerals because those minerals are coating the inside of the pipe. So many of our lead service lines may actually be coated with minerals. And as long as we keep preventing the minerals that are in the water, in the line, from being absorbed back into the water, you will have that protective lining, if you will, on the pipe.
Okay.
So the answer isn't only, do we have a lead service line? The answer is, what's the condition of that service line? And this is a question for doing lead testing on the water.
Okay.
It is possible to test the amount of lead in water inexpensively and find out that you do or do not have a problem.
And one last question, if I could, as it relates to fuel, I understand with paint that, a child could ingest the chip or the chalking of the paint. I understand with the pipes. How does the exposure most common with gas? Is it through the exhaust, or is it through actually coming in contact with the fuel itself? Or
so it has to do with, so when you burn the fuel that's leaded, the lead becomes suspended in the atmosphere in a very fine level, and we breathe that air. And when you breathe it in, you absorb it through your lungs.
okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Rustin?
So good morning. Thanks, Dr. Geller, for that presentation. One quick question. You had mentioned that in doctors' offices, the lead care analyzers are more research is showing that they're inaccurate. Do you know if those companies or if there's an active, is there active work to improve the technology for in-office testing?
So I know that the lead care analyzer just had a recommendation from FDA a month or two ago to not be used for additional restrictions placed on its use. But whether the technology can be improved to the point that these become accurate or not is, I think, a point of interest from the company. I don't know whether they've been successful or not.
Okay, Representative Maynard?
Thank you, Dr. Geller. Very informative presentation. I have a couple questions for clarity.
Sure.
In the beginning, you mentioned the density of the air and how it drops. Does that mean that infants are more susceptible to lead exposure just because they're crawling and not necessarily walking?
So lead that is in the air from chalking, from dust, is when the dust is stirred up, it gets stirred up, but it doesn't go necessarily as high in the room as it would. It's still heavier than air. So dust that's stirred up is going to stay closer to the floor and the infants are more likely to get it.
Okay. And then you also mentioned pesticides. Is that just external outdoor pesticides?
So that was just an example to say that any contaminant that's present in a food where the infant eats more of that food is going to get, if they eat more of the food, they're going to get a relatively disproportionate amount of that contaminant, whether it's lead, whether it's pesticide or what have you. But the data that's showing that was done on pesticides. But it's true in lead. If an infant ate a product that was leaded, they would get more lead compared to body surface if they ate more of the drug, more of the product. So if there was, for the sake of argument, a candy that was imported that was leaded and a 2-year-old was eating it as compared to a 22-year-old weighing a lot more, that person would have more lead absorbed per body weight.
And you mentioned sampling and just poor sampling. And there was something about it's required at between maybe 1 to 2 years old. And if they don't have it then it's about 5 years. And so since there is poor sampling or poor testing, does that mean that we need to expand the age of when testing is done since it does carry on into adulthood?
That's a great question. So the current strategy employed by most physicians is to test at 1 and 2 and to do questionnaire screening at 3, 4, 5, and 6 if the tests at 1 and 2 were completed and were normal. If the tests were not completed at 1 and 2, the sample next time they come in is to try and get a blood lead while they're there. But again, if you have to send the person to the lab and they don't go, it's hard to get a sample. And so these are complex questions, but that is the current strategy. It's not an expansion of the age we need. We need to facilitate somehow getting these samples collected at the point of service before the patient leaves the office.
And so that made me, can I keep that?
Of
Okay.
course.
And so that made me think also, you mentioned just transplacental way of getting the lead exposure from mother to child. And that would say that since the parent has lead exposure, they ultimately are at risk for having low IQ and have lived in a poor environment, which means that you have parents that really just don't even understand the importance of making sure their child is tested.
I think you have parents who don't understand the complexity of the issue. I think you have parents who, for various reasons, have difficulty getting to the lab or difficulty and don't see the vital importance of this. And so I think educating people on that is important. Educating people on things they could do are important. I think us saying that we want to expand our screening to women of childbearing age, so you get them before they are pregnant, would be something that would be very productive. It would be an expansion in the number of people who need to get blood leads, but saying that we want to recommend that or mandate that as standards of care for people who are receiving healthcare in Georgia that we fund would be good things. I think it would be cost effective and desirable. I know that that is done by many obstetricians already, but I think making it an expected standard of behavior would be good. Again, I can't say that the OB organizations or the family medicine, anyone else agrees with me, but that's my opinion.
And then if we have those women tested just in their childbearing age, my second thought behind that is if a woman is living in poverty, she probably doesn't have insurance. She's not going to the doctor. And when she is going to the doctor, it's because she's already pregnant. And that's because now she's eligible to get the Medicaid and insurance because she's pregnant. So what are your thoughts about that?
My thought about that is that if you could get her identified when she is insured because she's pregnant, at least you'd be able to do something if she has a second child.
Okay, second child. And one other thing we did not talk about, we talked a lot about exposure in the home, but not necessarily in the community. So my district is downtown Atlanta. It's being gentrified, and they are tearing down homes that have been there before the 70s. And there literally is just lumber, right, laying in plots of land. And I'm driving by and seeing kids walking and playing on this rubble. So what do we do about that?
I'm not an expert on the regulations about destruction or disposal or things like that, but the simplistic answer is it's an eyesore. It's a hazard for multiple reasons. We should clean it up. How we as the state make that happen, I'm not sure. That's a legal question, but clearly those are hazards for multiple reasons. Not just, even if there was no lead on the paint on the stuff, and even if there was nothing else hazardous there, just having the pile of debris fall on children is going to be dangerous.
Okay, and I had one last question. Last question is, you had the chart with the distribution of the IQ factors and as far as lead. So do you know, are there any studies that have a chart with distribution of how IQ is affected with the scatter plot with based on lead, based on poverty, based on just a multitude of other factors?
The slide I showed you was reported that they controlled for socioeconomic factors and other things. So they were trying to isolate lead as a single factor. Obviously, when you try to do a study and control for confounding factors, it's possible you miss a confounding factor. And there's been lots of criticisms about, well, maybe there are other confounding factors we haven't accounted for. But multiple studies have shown an impact of lead on IQ. Again, it varies from person to person. So we're talking about, when we say an effect on lead on IQ, we're talking about the average population, because for somebody whose body is very efficient at handling lead in some way, maybe it doesn't affect them at all. And other people whose body is not effective at handling lead, maybe it impacts them twice as much as the average. And so that results in the average we have, because you have one that twice the average and one at contributing 0, and you get the average of what we have. But that's the variability we know about. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Thank you. I believe Representative Drenner also has a question online.
Madam Chair, Dr. Geller, I really enjoyed your presentation. My first question is kind of two parts. Is there a natural background level for lead?
Yes. So the background level depends on where you are and what has happened in the community over time. The background level in a community that had a lot of lead industries is going to be higher because it's in soil, it's in water, it's everywhere, than it would be in a community that had no lead activities and has always been rural. A national forest would be expected to have, for example, a lower lead level than a community that did lead smelting or lead industries. And we've had some industrial zones that have done lead work in the past, and we've had other areas in which lead has been done zero. And so, yes, you would have some variation. But the substances that we can control, really we're looking at controlling exposures. And so it's important to talk about exposures for a minute. The fact that something is there doesn't necessarily mean it affects us. It has to get into the body or on the body to cause an effect. And so something that's hypothetically locked in a vault that is airtight, that is inside a bank, that is inside another building, is not going to get out and jump at us as easily as something that's sitting right there in front of us. But even if it's sitting there right in front of you, it's not going to affect you until you come in contact with it in some way, whether it's airborne, whether you touch it or whatever. And so the background level is important, but more important is it readily accessible to people? So lead in soil has been shown to be less impactful, for example, than lead in air, because people don't eat the soil normally.
Okay, thank you. I get the dose makes the poison and the location makes the poison and the population makes the poison. What's the biological half-life for lead?
If you look at that slide, it depends, but typically somewhere between 20 months and 7 years, depending on the age of the person. Children, most of the lead that's absorbed in your body gets deposited in bone. And as children grow, their bone changes more rapidly than adult bone. So once you're an adult, your bone doesn't change that much, that quickly. And so the half-life of lead in adults is longer than the half-life of lead in children.
Okay, thank you. Last question. So when you first started your presentation, you mentioned that you're at Emory, that you are the only location that does, I'm guessing, chelation therapy.
So we're not the only place that does. So Children's Health, I work for Emory, but I am based at Grady and Children's Healthcare of Atlanta at Hughes Spalding. Hughes Spalding is the only pharmacy in the state that routinely to our knowledge, stocks Succimer. It's a drug that is used rarely and is expensive, and we stock it as a public service not because we use that much of it, frankly, but we want to have it stocked somewhere so that when you need it, you can get it relatively quickly. In the past year, there's been a national shortage of Succimer, and even when we wanted it, we were running low, and it took us a week and a half to get it. So it's a question of having it available so that when someone wants it, we can supply it. We have historically shipped it by courier to other places in the state that want it in exchange for them making arrangements with the pharmacy, either pay for it or replace it.
That's it, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Geller. I appreciate your responses.
Thank you. Good questions too. And I had just a kind of in line also with what Representative Maynor asked. So we talked about the transplacenta transference possibility. So when are there current blood tests for pregnant women that include the lead reading?
So blood lead is its own test, but it can, once you're drawing blood, you can draw more tests at the same time. And so it can be done. I think that most obstetricians are getting blood leads in people they consider to be of high risk. But what I'm encouraging is that if we could figure out a way to get it before they're pregnant, then we don't have to deal with the fact that if you get a high number, now you have an exposed fetus already. So we'd like to get it before they get pregnant, so if possible.
So do I understand then that it is not standard operating procedure at all.
To my knowledge, there's nothing that says standard, that's a standard to get an adult blood lead level unless you're occupationally exposed.
Right. So there would be some indicator that would probably lead a physician to require that. It's not, there's not a place in our life other than these infant tests that children's tests that we're trying to get, where it is just, you're having your blood tested and just like they're testing your cholesterol or anything else or anemia, that shows up.
So
as well.
again, the question is what standards we have about OB and whether obstetricians are identifying that there's no state regulation to do that.
Okay. And the newborn is not tested.
So if you have any risk factor, we can test a newborn. If we know that your mother had an elevated blood lead, you can test a newborn. There's nothing that stops you from doing it. But it's not normally the high risk period because newborns aren't crawling around getting into
Right.
stuff in the house.
So only if they're indicators that
If they're
perhaps
indicators
there's exposure in the parent.
in the parent, correct.
Okay. And then I have one question too, just to clarify about soil. So in a place perhaps where there's a garden,
Yes,
what's the transference there into plants?
that's a great question. And unfortunately, a little bit more complicated. If you're growing a food crop in a soil that is leaded, some plants take up more lead than others, and it depends on the plant as to which crops are safe to grow in leaded soil and which crops are not. And I don't have a mental list, but it is something that is answerable. There is data. I just don't have the list in my head.
So some are safe, possibly.
Some are safe. and
Possibly.
Some plants do not take up lead.
Okay.
Some plants do take up lead. Some plants, the risk is on the soil, residual soil that is on it when you pull it. And if you wash the plant, that's fine. Some plants, it's in the plant, and that's the question. So it depends on which plant you're growing.
Okay. Okay.
Our
well,
colleagues with agricultural extension have this data. They know this data.
Right.
I just don't have it in my head.
Right. And we'll probably explore that a little bit later, but I just, since you have such a great background, I just wanted sort of your advice on
That's
that as
the
well.
data. I just
Okay.
don't, like I said, I have to look it up every time someone asks.
Okay. So I don't see any other questions right now. So thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you
Feller.
for
This
the
was
invitation to speak.
very informative. We appreciate you. Okay, and next we'll hear from Callan Wells, Health Policy Manager for GEARS, Georgia's Early Education Alliance for Ready Students. And Ms. Wells, if you would tell us a little bit more about your own background as well.
Just going to pull up my presentation here. Okay. So. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me today. Madam Chair, it's always great to work with you. And the rest of the members of the committee, thank you for taking the time to really focus on this really important issue for Georgia's children. So I'm Callan Wells. I am the Health Policy Manager at GEARS, the Georgia Early Education Alliance for Ready Students. We are a nonprofit research, policy, and advocacy organization, and we focus on children birth to 5. Our work really centers on early childhood education, healthy development, and family supports. And we just had our 10-year anniversary, so I have to point it out. So for 10 years, we've been bringing early childhood brain development science here to the legislature. So why early childhood? We know that in the first 3 years of life, the brain is developing at its most rapid pace. Infants and toddlers form more than 1 million new neural connections each second. And this is the building block for their lives ongoing. It determines educational achievement, economic productivity, responsible citizenship, lifelong health, strong communities, and successful parenting for the next generation. So that's why we think that this is such a critical topic, because when children experience environmental toxins during that really critical period of brain development, that's going to impact them for their entire lives. So in addition to the reasons that previous speakers have talked about, why we focus on early childhood, their behaviors, more likely to ingest or inhale lead dust. We also know that this is when their brains are developing. So we want to really focus on this these early years. This is a repetition of what previous speakers have said, but we know that lead affects the developing brain, damages the brain and nervous system, slows growth and development, can lead to learning and behavior problems, and hearing and speech problems. As previously indicated, there is no safe level of lead, and prevention is really the key here. So what do we know about lead here in Georgia? The Department of Public Health reports that 1 in 20 children in the state have elevated lead levels. There are certain counties that are at a heightened risk: Bibb, Chatham, Cobb, DeKalb, Fulton, Glenn, Gwinnett, Hall, Richmond, Sumter, Thomas, and Troup. 9.3% of Georgia's housing stock has an lead risk, according to the America's Health Ranking. We also know that we're currently experiencing heightened lead levels in Atlanta's west side. Representative Dempsey mentioned gardens. There's a grandmother and really community activist on the west side who has an organization called Historic West Side Gardens, who their goal is to have more gardens on the west side. So she was testing soil in her own yard when they, along with Emory, found elevated lead levels in her garden. Subsequently, her grandchildren were found to have elevated blood lead levels, and through conversations I've had with her, she's shared that they've experienced learning difficulties. The EPA is currently working on remediation in that area, which continues to grow. The area that they're working on continues to grow. So it started out in English Avenue, Vine City, and then they continue to expand the borders of where they're finding lead in the soil. This is just a repetition of what was said earlier. We know that lead has a significant cost to our country, and we know that the investment that we make has a very significant return when it's focused on prevention. So some recommendations, and I've broken them out into sort of 3 categories here. So first is prevention. We already do this to some extent, but just continuing to educate Georgians on the effects of lead on pregnant women and children and how they might prevent exposure. Screening and surveillance, again, promoting lead testing at regular intervals for young children and pregnant women. And as Dr. Geller mentioned, potentially women of childbearing age. Reducing the blood lead level threshold of lead abatement activities from, I guess it's 15 micrograms really for lead abatement to 5 to coincide with the CDC's recommendations. And then into remediation and support, consider additional funding for lead abatement in homes, childcare, and schools. And then invest in high quality early education and Head Start programs that provide wraparound services to young children, including help accessing healthcare. One of, as has been mentioned, hyperactivity, behavioral challenges that are present in young children, those children can really benefit from high quality early education. And in addition, and I should have added this, investing in early intervention in our Babies Can't Wait program that provides support for children who have experienced hyperactivity or, behavioral challenges as a result of exposure to lead. So thank you so much. I'm open to any questions, although I may defer to Dr. Geller, who's really an expert, if any of them get too scientific for me.
Well, he's in the room, so that's a good thing. That's
Or
great.
Dr. Mutic is
We're-
here
we're
too.
fortunate. Yes, Representative Maynard.
I don't have a comment more so. The Atlanta West Side is actually in my district. And so I know exactly where you're talking about. And I think that, Madam Chair, if we discuss more about soil, because not only this historic West Side garden, the place that I mentioned with Dr. Geller, where the lead lumber is just in the yard, they're actually building a community garden there for Washington High School. And so I think it's very important that we figure out more information about the environmental impact of the soil.
Yeah.
We'll seek some more information about that. I mean, I know the uncertainty as a grandparent that you could have perhaps impacted that. There may be other sources that also contributed to a child having a higher level, but just that that pain would be very difficult, I think.
Yeah, GEARS has been working with Emory, the Department of Public Health, Historic West Side Gardens, and the West Side Health Collaborative around helping inform residents in that area that they may be at elevated risk and to go ahead and get their children tested for lead if they're in that area. We've also reached out to pediatricians and childcare in that area to help inform residents that they're at elevated risk. But it's a little heartbreaking to know that. Yeah.
And all at the same time that we're also encouraging people to grow,
Yeah.
to, do that in their own backyard and know that they have really fresh vegetables and fruits. So
Because-
it's a conflicted message right now.
Right.
I would
As
say.
mentioned, nutrition is a critical piece to mitigating lead's effects. And we want to, support nutrition, but also keep kids safe. So.
Okay, do we have any questions from our online audience members? Not seeing any, but thank you for all that GEARS brings to us. I know as we continue this discussion in the months ahead, we'll rely on it. Now, as always, I really appreciate the succinct recommendations that y'all put forward every time we have a study committee. So
Yes.
hopefully we'll be able to have some great impact.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our next and final presenter is Dr. Abby Mutic. I hope I'm saying it right, but you can correct me without a doubt, coming to us, assistant professor. I'm going to let you tell a little about yourself because
No
I know there's
problem.
more to it. And I believe we may have a handout here as well among y'all. Yes, this one.
Share. There we go.
Well, I would say good morning, but it's almost lunch, so it's kind of afternoonish, huh? And I realize I'm standing in the way of lunch, so I'll try to be brave. But thank you for having me. I am Dr. Abby Mutic. I am an assistant professor at the School of Nursing at Emory, as well as the director of the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit here in the Region 4 of the United States. And with that being said, I do need to say, we are funded by ATSDR and the CDC, through the CDC, as well as EPA. But today I'm sharing my personal views and opinions. So I'm excited that the conversation has already started to turn toward the pregnant woman or the pregnant person, because that's really my expertise and where I do much of my research and clinical practice. So we think about this person being a very vulnerable entity, because not only is this exposure to lead affecting her, but also this growing person inside. And we think about too that we, as a prenatal care and clinicians, we strive to embrace the fact that pregnancy is very protective, and sort of have these special superpowers to fend off any kind of external stressor. And that's all good and well, except in the case of lead. So lead does pass easily through the placenta through passive diffusion, where it has been shown to affect fetal brain's development in the first trimester. And so we think about this idea of born pre-polluted and how that is not necessarily something that can be prevented unless we start talking about this preconceptual time period. So with the rise of maternal mortality and neonatal morbidity, we've seen a big push toward public health priorities and awareness. But we have to remember that about 50% of pregnancies are unplanned. And so we must think about these people not being necessarily in the mindset of prevention. About 80% of women of reproductive age will conceive at some point in their life, and another 10% will attempt. So nearly all people within that reproductive timeframe are very sensitive. And that being said, we know that at any given time, if we were to draw the blood of a pregnant person, we would be able to analyze around 43 different chemicals or more at any given time, lead being one of them. This window of susceptibility is basically referring to this time point that we go in and out of throughout life, from the time of infancy all the way through the end of life. And it's when a person becomes more or less sensitive to their environment, and where they may be exposed to similar amounts. By the time they become pregnant, they may be able to develop more sensitivities to those exposures. So those at risk are going to be the various occupations that we've already discussed, but it's also about where we live, where we eat and breathe, and where we play. For the fetus, they have their own critical developmental windows. And we know that typically happens in that first trimester, so that 0 to 12 weeks, while the infant or the fetus is growing. There's massive differentiation in the organs and the tissues. And any stressor that invades that space is likely to affect the development from that point forward. It is not reversible. Once an organ or a tissue has been disrupted, it will grow that way for the rest of pregnancy. For that critical period, we think about the brain development really expanding between that 9 and 16-week mark that you see in this pink window. Teratogens may already be on board, but by the time that brain is really expanding and differentiating, we're still in that first 2-second trimester right there. As already stated, there is no recommended safe level that has ever been identified, and that remains true for pregnancy as well. We know that this is a dangerous toxicant that invades the maternal neural spaces as well as the fetal developmental spaces of the brain. Again, it easily passes through the placenta, but it also passes through breast milk. And so we know that there are chronic exposures to that fetus if it goes untreated or undetected. So throughout pregnancy as well as the breastfeeding period. I want to think about thinking about acute versus chronic exposures. So generally, when we think about an environmental exposure, we think of acute exposures. We find that something has been leaked or has been exploded, or we think about these massive environmental exposures being kind of an event. But with lead, we also see, as in soil, that it can be a low dose chronic exposure over time, which is highly undetected for the most part. And in the body, it's the same way. This body burden can be a chronic low dose exposure, but yet still yielding some signs and symptoms in a healthcare kind of setting. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So the main target for lead toxicity is the nervous system for both the pregnant person and the fetus. We see signs of delirium, seizures, coma, and even death related to lead toxicity. In pregnancy, we do see that there are adverse outcomes strongly associated, such as spontaneous abortions, or also known as miscarriages. We see things like preterm labor and birth. We see low birth weight, and we see poor pregnancy outcomes that are associated, such as hypertension. You may have heard of things called preeclampsia or gestational hypertension, all these things associated with high blood pressure. We see neuropathy, tremors, anemia that significantly increases in pregnancy, headaches, weight loss, concentration, behavior, muscle aches and joint aches, as well as fatigue. So during pregnancy and lactation, we see that lead can actually be mobilized from the bones. And so this is, again, back to that susceptibility piece of pregnancy that's different than any other time of life. So we see that bones that have been stored, lead that's been stored within the bone can become mobilized. This is due to increased bone turnover related to the pregnancy itself, as well as hormonal changes and huge shifts in metabolism during pregnancy. The blood levels tend to increase because of this, specifically in pregnancy. So she's already been exposed, she's now pregnant, and now she has a dramatic increase in the lead. So this is a graph from a case study. This case study is referring to a 24-year-old African-American woman who was seeing her clinician for routine pregnancy and prenatal care, and at some point was showing some signs related to neurology concerns. And at that point, they identified an elevated blood level of 43. That was the maximum level that was identified. When they started to do an exposure assessment within the home and within the environment, they found that the source of exposure was coming from a teapot that she was boiling water in daily for tea. Immediately, the source was mitigated and her lead levels dropped throughout pregnancy. And you can see at around 30 weeks, they sort of stabilized around that 16 number at the end, and then down to 13. At delivery, the baby had been having a lead level drop as well after that 43 peak around 19 weeks, but at delivery had a cord blood level of 10. So you can see that this is kind of a chronic exposure over time. This is a graph that was produced in Pediatrics journal, and it talks about the lead level of 5 and less. and how that is also associated with IQ. And I bring this to the table because so far we've seen literature that is talking about levels greater than 5 and those shifts in IQ. This is a prime example of levels less than 5, even less than 1.43, also associated with an IQ loss in children. So the next steps that I recommend based on these points, I want to bring to the table a idea that prenatal risk assessment and lead screening should really occur for all pregnant people. Right now, the current recommendation, as you had mentioned earlier in questioning, is that only those showing a risk factor of 1 risk factor, not multiple, should be then encouraged to have a lead screen. Otherwise, if that's never assessed or if it's not identified, no persons are being screened in pregnancy for standard of care. I'd like to consider follow-up levels less than 5. So just because a lead is at 1.43, we see those associations with IQ. So those should be taken to a follow-up and really resolved down to 0 over time. Thinking about nutrition and what is working and not working. So calcium and vitamin C supplementation have been shown to decrease lead levels within the breast milk as well as the blood. Thinking about wider blood level testing in the community and within clinics and within laboratories. So right now, as Dr. Geller had mentioned, we have a problem with our laboratories needing to have extensive amounts of time to develop their testing, analyze the results, return the results back. By that time, we may or may not have connection with the family. We also see in Westside that even though we've been in the community as much as possible to promote the idea of folks being tested, of the children being tested for their blood levels, we're not seeing populations increase their blood level testing. So we have a lot of work to do to get folks to the table to allow point of care in the field that's of sound significance and quality. Also would like to expand this idea that that the cost associated with laboratory fees and with testing fees could be subsidized to a level that all folks would be able to get their blood tested with or without insurance. And then again, bringing incentives to the testing round would be something that could really help families buy into testing. I'll take questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions? Representative Maynard.
Thank you. Out of just curiosity, I see a lot of the secondary diagnoses are neural related. Do we know why hypertension is just out there? That seems totally different than everything else.
That's a good question. I think the idea is that when there is an additional layer of exposure that the body is really working hard to push through the renal system and to have not only the kidneys, but the liver to try to pull out those toxicants, is causing more strain on the body. And that strain through those vessels can increase this risk of hypertension. We do also see that there's a lot of similarities in the folks that are becoming more susceptible to high blood pressure related to obesity, poor nutrition, et cetera.
And you mentioned, thank you. You mentioned risk factors and you would like for childbearing or pregnant women to all be tested. What
Screened.
would screened?
Mhm.
What would they be asking? What is your zip code? What what are the screening questions that you would propose?
That's a good question. There's actually some screens out there that are recommended by ACOG with the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. And I think it's a series of 10 questions. So it's published, it's validated, and it shows to identify those folks that maybe live in a territory that has known soil issues or occupational related issues. It also talks about immigrant status. So if you recently moved from a part of the world that has higher lead levels, also talks about nutrition deficiencies.
And thank you. My last question is, you say calcium and vitamin C supplementation can decrease it. Are there any supplements that are known to increase it? And the reason I'm asking that question is a lot of African Americans are anemic, and which means they take iron supplements. So any supplements that are known to increase the lead exposure?
That's a great question. There are no supplements that are known to increase, like as part of the vitamins that are encouraged for pregnancy. Now, with that being said, there's lots of supplements out there that aren't regulated. And so I can't really speak to those that are maybe on the homeopathic realm. However, related to iron deficiency, iron actually also has been shown to decrease. So this idea that iron deficiency anemia is a risk factor, it's kind of like they're brothers and sisters. So one that has iron deficiency anemia may also very likely have some lead issues, and vice versa. So the thing is when you have increased dilution related to pregnancy, you have a lot of extra blood volume. And so that kind of diffuses some of your blood cells into a bigger space of water, so to speak. And when that happens, you also have an increased flow of lead that comes from your bones that was stored. And so when that occurs, you may see both at the same time.
Representative Gamble.
Thank you. Are you aware of any other states that currently subsidize the cost of testing?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Dr. Rustin.
So thank you for the presentation. This is more of a comment. There is a risk factor questionnaire that the department has developed. It's actually in our packet. I just wanted to point that out, that I think would probably be helpful if we work with you all to just take a look at it. It's validated by the CDC, but I don't believe it has questions specific to pregnant women. And so this particular questionnaire has been provided to all physicians, all pediatricians across the state, and it's been in existence for a number of years. And it's just a simple screening questionnaire to determine if a child needs to be tested for lead. And so at some point would be interested in you taking a look at it and offering your input on that.
Definitely.
Online, do we have any questions or comments? Not seeing any. Thank you so much. And thank you for the work that you're doing too. I know it's so important and vital to this. So that brings us to the conclusion of this first meeting. I've learned a lot already. I don't know about y'all. I know we've probably got a lot more questions in our mind too about where we should go. And so I want you to feel that you can reach out to Tara among the committee members if you have something else that you feel like as we begin to formulate the next meetings ahead. That's going to be really important. Any contacts, any information that you might have, or any thoughts that have been spurred by today's very, very informative discussion, I think. So I'm not seeing any buttons pushed at this moment in time. So I feel like we've probably finished up our first day's work. Thank you thank you to our staff, particularly, also particularly to Betsy and Sarah for being here as well. So for the committee members and the presenters, we do have lunch following this right now, and it can be a grab and go if you need to get on to the next commitment that you have. And it is around the corner, actually in 410, excuse me, it's in the HBRO conference room, just right around the corner to our left out of here and through the double door. So you'll need to be standing with someone who can swipe that door to get you in and out of there as well. And lunch is brought to us today by Wendy Clifton and Terminus Strategies. Thank you to each of you for being here and for presenting all of this information. I look forward to the next meeting. I think we're going to do some great work. So I will adjourn us now and we will continue. Thank you.